Welcome, everybody, to the Health Law and Ethics Network. This is our first monthly lunchtime seminar for 2024. I'm Professor Paula O'Brien from Melbourne Law School, and I'm one of the directors of the network. I'd like to acknowledge that the Melbourne Law School, stands on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So thank you everyone for joining us for the first Helen seminar for the year. So we run a monthly lunchtime seminar series on Zoom, and the idea of the seminar series is to profile the research that is being undertaken at the University of Melbourne in the area of health law and ethics by researchers here in collaboration with researchers from other institutions or the medical or legal profession or other excellent collaborators that many of the academics here have. So we're very pleased for the first seminar of the year to be presented by Professor Heather Douglas and Dr. Leah Sharman. So Heather is a professor here at Melbourne Law School, and Leah was here at the law school working on this research that's going to be presented. She's now at the University of Queensland and holds a DECRA. So this seminar today is on family violence, sex, strangulation and consent. So as we always do for these seminars, our presenters will present their research for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for discussion, at which point you can either put your questions into the chat or raise your hand so that we can have a discussion with our presenters. So Heather and Leah, thanks very much for presenting today. We're so delighted to have you, and so I welcome you to start the presentation.
Thanks very much, Paula, and all of the Helen Network. It's really great to be here to be able to present this research to you today. This research, and I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I'm speaking to you from. The research I want to talk about today with Leah is research that really started back in around 2012 with my colleague Robin Fitzgerald. And we were doing research on protection orders and noticing that a lot of people alleged strangulation in their protection orders, and yet there were never any criminal offences, or frequently no criminal offences attached to those strangulation claims. And in a way, our research contributed to the development of a specific criminal offence of strangulation in Queensland. And subsequently, criminalisation of strangulation has happened all around Australia, most recently just a few months ago in Victoria. Whether that's good or bad is the subject of our ongoing research, but the introduction of the strangulation offence in Queensland offered a really good opportunity for us to look at the implementation and effects of criminalisation of strangulation. And there's a website there on the slide where you can go and have a look at all of the work that we've been doing around that question of what's going on with implementation of strangulation. But in the context of that, we spoke to a lot of domestic and family violence support workers and men's behaviour change workers. And the first part of the research that I want to present on is around that part of the qualitative research. And that'll be followed by the second part of our research, which, as you'll see, follows on quite neatly from that qualitative study. But before we get to that, so just to talk a little bit about strangulation itself and why strangulation is such a big issue. There's a significant amount of research from the US which has demonstrated that in the context of domestic and family violence, strangulation is a real risk for homicide in the weeks and months following that initial strangulation event. So this is research based on hospital admissions in the US, hundreds of hospital admissions, comparing women who claim they've been strangled versus women who make other claims in relation to their injuries, and following up those women afterwards. And there's been a discovery that women who report strangulation are 7 times more likely to be killed after that initial strangulation report in the weeks and months that follow that initial report of strangulation. So it's been recognised as a significant risk factor for homicide in the context of domestic and family violence. Subsequent to that kind of research being developed in the US, there's been quite a lot of research about family violence and strangulation. And Gail Strack at the Strangulation Prevention Institute, which is a massive institute in the US, has done a lot of research in this space with others. And they've discovered there that about 1 in 4 women who report domestic and family violence report incidents of strangulation. And there are real connections, obviously, between strangulation and coercive control and the debates about that. There's no better way to demonstrate your control over a partner than showing them that you hold their life in their hands by putting your hands around their neck and squeezing the breath out of them, literally. You can show that you really have control over them. So it's very common in domestic and family violence relationship. Mostly, 97% of cases, usually with manual strangulation with the hands. We also know that even when women report that they've been strangled and they've lost consciousness as a result of that, in 50% of cases, they don't report any physical injuries. So there may be injuries down the track, like pregnancy, miscarriage, which we know is associated with strangulation. There's sometimes bruising, but often the injuries that we see associated with strangulation are actually only become clear weeks or months down the track. Brain injuries been associated with strangulation as well. There are a range of other issues such as thyroid storm, which can happen weeks or months down the track as well and result in death. So strangulation is a really serious risk factor, and it's also a serious, it can cause serious injury at the time that it's done. There's been some really helpful work in the US. Some of the key research actually is from an incredibly unethical study done in the 1940s, where there were 500 controlled strangulations of people in mental health institutions and prisons. And there was a pressure cuff developed to test what the effects of strangulation were. So we know that actually quite a slight amount of pressure can cause death. It's been described as pulling open a can of drink. The pressure it takes to open that can of drink is all we need, with the pressure placed in the right place on the neck, to actually cause death or unconsciousness. So it's fairly quick. We know that strangulation can cause death within 60 seconds, 62 seconds. And obviously there are other issues that happen earlier, such as anoxic seizure and unconsciousness, which obviously have implications for brain injury. The other study there, this first study is the unethical study I mentioned from Ross, and the second study backed up the results of the first, and that looked at filmed hangings in the US. So we know basically that strangulation is a high risk factor in DV cases particularly, and we know that it can cause injury very quickly and sometimes fatal injury. So this is really the research that has led to this strangulation. And the problem with other offences in our criminal statutes was that assault often was low penalty, associated with a very low penalty, given the risk and danger of this offence. Attempted murder was difficult to prove the intention to cause death or grievous bodily harm, and other harm or injury associated offences, there may be no injury that's visible or detected in relation to strangulation, so they weren't particularly helpful either. So Queensland introduced this particular offence, which is on the slide at the moment. A person commits a crime if the person unlawfully chokes, suffocates or strangles another person, and that person's in a domestic relationship with the other person, and it's associated with domestic violence under the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act. Notably too, assault is not an element of the offence. So just to talk a little bit more carefully about those elements of the offence, notably the offence in Queensland must be without consent. So this means that there are potential circumstances where a person may consent to strangulation, and then it wouldn't be an offence in the Queensland context. Victoria, I know, has dealt with this issue a little bit differently. Must be in the context of domestic and family violence. This means generally in Queensland that strangulation's been charged in the context of domestic and family violence, which was the purpose of the introduction of the offence. Assault's not an element of strangulation, and the reason why that was introduced originally was because they didn't want to have a provocation defence available, which is available in the statutes in Queensland. But it has other effects because it challenges what the definition of consent is in Queensland. So far, there hasn't been any question around what the definition of consent is in Queensland. Is it the assault definition? And if you're a criminal lawyer, that would be the common law definition, where you can consent to events where there's no injury associated with the actual assault, but it's usually possible to consider to consent to perhaps bodily injuries, although not serious harms, depending on public policy considerations. So that would be one possibility of how we understand consent. But given that assault is specifically not an element, does this mean that there's another definition of consent in the Queensland context? It's really unclear. We don't have any reported cases on how we might define consent. In Queensland, there are a couple of cases which I mentioned on the screen, which involve allegedly by the perpetrator, consensual strangulation in the context of sex, in situations where the person's been charged with rape, and part of the rape has been strangulation, and the perpetrator has alleged that the victim in those cases consented to the strangulation as part of the sexual contact. So that's the only place this has been looked at. And of course, because they've been rape offences, the definition of consent has been the sexual offences definition of consent. So there does seem to be a gap in the law in Queensland in relation to this issue. And these have become important questions for us in the context of our research. Thinking back to that unethical research I mentioned before, one of the things that the researchers found was when they put the pressure cuff on people, they said to them that they could make a movement to have the pressure cuff released, or they could ask for it to be released. But it was interesting that nobody seemed to be able to do that at a certain point in the strangulation, which suggests that even if there is a context where a person might give consent to strangulation, they might get to a point in the strangulation where they can't, in sexual context, perhaps use the safe word or remove their consent. So this is an interesting question that has started to be raised on our research. And really this has come out through this focus group study that we've looked at, which is part of our broader study. So our focus groups spoke to 35 domestic violence service workers. 16 of them were DV support workers, and the others were men's behaviour change workers. And we spoke to them through 11 different seminars. 11 different focus groups were conducted with that group of people. All but 2 of those focus groups did mention this question of sex, consent, strangulation, domestic violence. So remember that our focus group participants were all people that were working in the context of domestic violence, either with survivors or working with perpetrators where there'd been sub-admissions of domestic violence. But this kept coming up, this question of consent being alleged in relation to strangulation, so trying to disentangle the family violence from the strangulation during sex. So this was something that we've decided to explore more. So in our focus group studies, we thematically analysed the content of them, and we came up with a few themes from around this particular issue. The first was that the workers seemed to be saying that, at least among their younger clients, strangulation during sex is being normalised. They said this was happening through mainstream media. You see journal articles, newspaper articles, which tell you how to choke safely during sex, and we've subsequently looked for these and found them. That sex is normalised through pornography, that young women are watching porn too, and it's being normalised. And there was reports that these couples, that despite the fact that there's family violence in these couples, they are watching porn together or separately, and this strangulation is coming up during that watching of pornography. But also, perhaps disturbingly, information is provided to some women by their abusive partner. So some women have told their support workers, he knew the way. The client said he knew exactly where to press, and he knew that if he pressed on the front of my neck, explained that in the way he did, he told her it would get a high from it, and that would heighten the experience that she was feeling. That's how he said it to her. So it seems that strangulation during sex is being used to heighten orgasm. There's been a lot of research into this, and it's challenged whether this is the case. We know that when you strangle someone and they start to lose their breath or their blood flow, and then you return the blood or breath flow to them, there is a heightened sense for that person. So it might be that is creating this increased orgasm if the timing is right. So it's the fact that you've lost breath or blood flow that is creating this high, rather than necessarily connected to anything to do with the rest of what's going on in your body, although this is uncertain. So there is this concern that strangulation is being normalised during sex. Workers also talked about the idea that the consent is not informed consent. They said that really their clients don't understand the risks. One worker said when we talked to them about it and explained it, they were not aware of those risks, so it's not informed consent if you're going to look at consent. Or their consent is based on inaccurate information. The women I've talked to, they've based their decisions on information that actually wasn't accurate for them. They also pointed out that in these relationships, consent is often underpinned by coercion. Sometimes there's strangulation that's non-consensual, but then they're coerced into thinking that it's okay, according to one worker. Another worker said, can you actually consent to something that's so dangerous? And this brings us back to the loophole point we mentioned before. But this worker said, it just seems to me that how can you consent to the potential death in terms of the actions that you're consenting to? I understand in terms of sexual practice that some people might choose to engage in, but there's a lot of misinformation about that. The other point is that the workers pointed out, thanks Leah, that we're working in environments of coercive control. So remember, the people that we were speaking to in these focus groups were women that were either seeking support from a domestic violence support worker, or they were men engaging with behaviour change programs through these services. So these were people that were living in relationships of family violence. So the workers said we're working in environments of coercive control. Often the concept of consent isn't something that's part of these women's lives. So how do we move from a situation where there's non-consensual violence in parts of their relationship and then move into the bedroom where there's consensual strangulation, consensual violence? So they said this was kind of a complex question. Another worker said obviously she didn't consent, but she couldn't stop him from doing it, but she didn't have any choice. He was much bigger than her. She didn't want it to happen. So that's a real question of whether there was actually consent in that particular case. The other point to make is from the men's behaviour change workers, they were really clear that the men they were speaking to often would ask, when they were asked by their men's behaviour change workers, well, we're talking about violence, do you mean in sex or not in sex? Because the answer I'll give you will be different. So, for example, if it's not in sex, the violence is this. If it's in sex, well, this is consensual. So I've absolutely sat with clients, perpetrators who are telling me they're not physically abusive, they're not violent. When we talk about sexual behaviour, we talk about what's going on. They're disclosing hair pulling, they're disclosing strangulation, that's consensual. It's being put into this consensual context because within an abusive relationship, it's being normalised. So a lot going on in that quote, but essentially that men are kind of drawing this distinction between violence used in sex and violence during the rest of their relationship, the non-sexual part of their relationship, and the questions that really raises here. Finally, in terms of the themes that we saw, this notion that requirement for non-consent opens up a loophole. So remember that the offence in Queensland must be without, in situations where there's no consent. So essentially that's an element of the offence. So once consent is raised by the accused person, if it was to be raised, arguably this would raise the question of whether they're actually, we can prove strangulation. So workers said about this, I think consent opens up a loophole. I guess it's the prosecutor then has to make an argument that she hasn't consented, and you find perpetrators are very good at manipulating that as well. Another one said all he has to turn around and say is she wanted it. How are you going to disprove that someone consented or not? Now, it might be that we didn't come across many of these cases. We did look at lots of prosecution files, and we did look at lots of administrative files around this. And it wasn't clear that there were lots of cases where consent was raised in relation to strangulation offences. And certainly when we spoke to defence lawyers and prosecutors, they said that normally where these issues would be raised, they would be raised in relation to strangulation during sex. They would be prosecuted as sex offences or rape offences. So that's probably why we're not seeing these questions of consent raised in strangulation offences. But nevertheless, this consent question certainly muddies the water for these women in relationships that are often that are violent at the same time as there may be this consensual strangulation going on for them. So in terms of what we find from this particular part of the study, we see that there are clear needs for better information about the risks and dangers of strangulation during sex in the broader community, but obviously also for workers to provide to their clients and the communities they're working with. We think that there's a need for clarification on the law of consent, either legislatively or via case law. And a question really here is whether consent should be available, given what we know about the dangers and risks associated with strangulation. And in many of these cases, people aren't going to be experts on exactly where to press and how to get the best out of the situation of the press and so on, and exactly how much force to use. Really, should this actually be something that we encourage consent to? But then again, is the criminal law the place to deal with this particular issue? We also thought from this started us thinking about, well, is this going on? Is this particular cohort of domestic violence support workers and men's behaviour change workers that are working with a particular cohort of violent people that are using this in their relationships? And that led us to a lot of work in the US by people like Debbie Herbernick, especially her, who have been looking at college samples. And we thought, well, it's going on in the US and it seems to be quite common. So what's the story in Australia? Is it common in Australia? Is it in terms of situations of non-violent relationships? How common in relationships that don't see themselves as violent relationships? And really there was no information about that, which led us to the next part of our study. But just before I go and leave the rest of the discussion to Leah at this point, we do have an article coming out in the Journal of Criminal Law which explores the issues that we've talked about just now in relation to these focus groups, and that should be coming out in the next, probably within the month. It'll be on our website that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So over to you, Leah, to talk about the next part of our research.
So as Heather was saying, we really were interested in this kind of question of like, is this actually happening in Australia? Just in kind of a broader context outside of the domestic and family violence context, like, you know, what are we looking at here? And so we kind of moved into this other research stream that is kind of adjacent and sort of touching on these same questions of you know, consent and attitudes and understanding of risk and those sorts of things. So we did sort of start down this path, and this was actually one of the articles that we were sent by one of the DV workers here, which is why some people are turned on by choking during sex and how to do it safely according to the experts. And so, and like just a little the heading there, let our experts teach you the proper technique, which I think is quite ominous. And so really kind of in what Heather was saying, the really tricky thing that we have to start to think about here is that attitudes towards strangulation in sex are becoming very mainstream. Like this was in Men's Health, and we found other articles as well that are online. And it's no longer just part of this sort of small community necessarily that we'd be thinking of that's doing BDSM and kink and that sort of thing. Like maybe this is moving more forward into the mainstream. So another article that was published last year that did an actual content analysis of 27 articles that were on choking. So that's kind of the more common usage term as part of sex, choking rather than strangulation. As strangulation, 27 online articles on choking, and found that it is mostly really described positively, that it will be enjoyable, that it can be done safely. And they even say that, oh, it can be done safely even after they describe the risks. But very few of them, like this article, actually used any experts to guide them on this kind of safety journey that they were trying to take people on. So we know that US estimates are quite high and stunning. So we started off and we looked at Debbie Herbeneck's research here, and this is one of her papers. And the prevalence estimates in a random sample of about 5,000 university students there in the US found that about a quarter of women and men were engaging in strangulation practices. So a quarter of women saying that they were choked the last time that they had sex, and a quarter of men saying that they had choked someone. So you can see there that there's this gendered, disproportionate gendered effect that we would kind of expect based on our knowledge of how, you know, these kind of domination things go in sex. And so for, and also recognizing there that you have quite a number of people who are transgender and non-binary who are actually engaging in both types of behavior. So seemingly occurring quite commonly, if you think like 25%, like a quarter of people, the last time they had sex were strangled. Like that's quite alarming. And so we're thinking more about this, okay, this pornography question, and this study came out last year as well from the Debbie Herbeneck's group, and this one is by Wright and colleagues. And this one is about looked at consuming pornography and how that might lead to choking sexual partners. So this looked at university-aged men and whether they consumed pornography. That led to greater exposure to pornographic depictions of sexual choking, which ultimately led to greater choking of sexual partners. But that these things were kind of mediated. So you watch pornography that depicts sexual choking, and then that leads to this belief that it is pleasurable, that it is safe, and that it does not require consent. So that's pretty alarming and concerning, that they're kind of watching porn and being like, oh, okay, that's safe and I don't even need to ask. So that's wonderful. And so these young men are engaging in this behavior without really any kind of knowledge of the risk. The primary source of knowledge here seeming to be pornography that they're watching that has choking involved. And so this really indicates that sexual practices are really trending towards this normalization of violence just kind of in the bedroom and increasing among young people, and associated with sort of this blurred understanding of its danger and how consent might be negotiated, or if it needs to even be negotiated at all. So that kind of led us to our research here. So we wanted to know what's happening in Australia. So we did this, we did a couple of studies, and so I'm going to talk to you primarily about study 1 today. And so this was the preliminary research that we did that looked at 168 undergraduate students from the University of Queensland. Again, our focus on Queensland here. And generally the breakdown as you would expect, but slightly more women in this sample, and most people living in Queensland. At the end, I will have like a brief touch on our large national prevalence study that we hope to move forward on getting published and all sorts of things shortly. But we had quite a number of like thousands of people participate in this study from across Australia. So it was nationally distributed, and we have a good sort of distribution of gender and sexuality. And we only looked at participants who were 18 to 35 years old because we're really interested in this sort of younger cohort of people. But really kind of in this preliminary study that we were looking at, we really had these primary research questions. So is strangulation during sex happening at similar rates in Australia as compared to the US? Do people know even if there is any legislation around it? Are there any consequences or harms that people understand or recognize have happened to them regarding strangulation? And could we make a difference there in that sort of perception of strangulation as something that is enjoyable or positive, that seemingly seems to be mediating that move into actually doing choking or actively participating in choking during sex? So firstly, I guess we wanted to know, are people even aware of this legislation? We had, we did this study in 2022, at the end of 2022, start of 2023, and really the legislation came out in 2016. So I wanted to know, do people even know that there is any legislation around this? Do they know about it? And no, they don't know about it really at all. So despite pretty much all participants living in Queensland, there were and they're having that strangulation offence in place. 83% responded no when they asked if they knew of a strangulation offence in Queensland or in the state or territory where they lived in Queensland. And then there was like another 9% who said they just didn't know, like in other ways. So really upwards of 90% of people just have no clue that this legislation even exists. And so while it was clear that we also asked them, you know, what do you think about whether it should be legislated? Should we legislate strangulation? Or we in the survey, we called it choking. And consensual strangulation was non-consensual strangulation, sorry, seemingly a mouthful, was viewed as something that should be a crime. But consensual strangulation was sort of a bit more tricky, viewed less positively, that it should be a criminal offence. So if you consent to it, people are like, yeah, but you're consenting, so it shouldn't really be anywhere near being a crime or anything. And consent to strangulation in general, we found that women were really more supportive of criminalisation of strangulation, even when it was consensual. And you'll kind of see this theme as we go through, that women are kind of reacting slightly differently to men, pretty much most situations here, because they're a lot more prone to the risk of strangulation. So next we wanted to know, okay, is this even happening? Is it something we need to be concerned about? They don't really know that there's any legislation, but okay, maybe they're just not doing it. But no, they are doing it. So we had more than a half of people had ever been strangled during sex, and about half of people reported ever strangling someone during sex. So this is whether they've done it once or whether they've done it 50 times. And we're looking, you know, a little bit less than the US, but still quite high, right? 18% reported being strangled the last time they had sex. Women were more likely to be strangled the last time they had sex than men, and 13% of men reported that 13%, sorry, of people reported strangling someone that last time they had sex, and men more likely than women to do the strangling. And so this teamed up really nicely with this kind of frequency question, right? So women reported it was happening to them more often. So we asked them, you know, how much is this happening to you? Is it happening frequently during your sexual encounters? Women are saying, yeah, it's happening pretty frequently. And men are saying they're more frequently strangling their partners than women. So that all kind of lines up with how we kind of view strangulation. None of these results are that unexpected, though it's still quite surprising to see how high the numbers are and how much people are participating in this act. And so then we were wondering if there are, whether people understand or know about the consequences and harms from strangulation. So it's generally viewed as not harmful. I know these numbers are doing something, but don't worry about that. This is probably not harmful, people felt, and that it could probably be safe, right? And there was a significant difference between men and women's perceptions of harm, with young women really perceiving strangulation to be more harmful than men. And young women were also more concerned if they would lose consciousness. And again, I think this points to this idea that women are really at the forefront of risk here. It's at the front of their minds. They know that it's risky. They're the ones primarily, you know, being strangled more frequently, more often, and possibly men feel it's potentially that men feel like they're a little bit protected. Maybe they can withstand more pressure, whether that's in their mind or in reality. They can withstand more pressure on the neck, so they wouldn't be concerned if, you know, they don't think that it's that harmful. So we asked people, you know, qualitatively about their experiences, and some people explained that they would be concerned but would be too embarrassed to see a health professional about strangulation injury, which I think is very concerning. I think we're not having conversations about strangulation, and people then become embarrassed to say, well, I was being choked during sex, and they don't want to go and see a health professional about it and potentially delay health treatment. But others really felt like they trusted their partner to safely engage in strangulation, and that kind of like alleviated their fears of injury, like somehow their partners would know exactly when to stop or would be able to recognize when their face turned blue or something, which would be very like, that's too long. I don't know if I need to tell people, but you've gone too long. And this kind of was also played out in our very large survey, right? People really feeling like it's fine as long as it's safe, but not really any kind of discussion about what is safe, like what makes it safe, how can you do it safely given all of the risks and the potential risk of harm. So we asked people if you've ever experienced any consequences of strangulation when you've been strangled previously. So this is not just like the last time, but ever. So we had participants who were strangled. 28% reported negative consequences from strangulation, like not being able to breathe, having a sore throat, or becoming unconscious, etc. And 45% reported positive experience, like they or their partner had a more intense orgasm. But we also had like 25% of people say nothing happened, like neither of them experienced anything good or bad. So I kind of just wonder, for those people, why are they bothering engaging with it? Like, what's with that cohort of people as well that don't get anything out of it? But there's still like a number of people saying, yes, we're getting positive benefits, but also all of these negative consequences too are happening. And we do find here that, you know, people who, sorry, that recipient and actor information. So the yellow bars are people who are strangled, and the orange bars are people who have strangled somebody else. And so we do find that the people who are strangling others both seem to perceive that everybody's getting more positive enjoyment out of it than the people who are actually being strangled. And then they're not really perceiving very many consequences or any kind of negative harms that have occurred. So as part of this, we wanted to know, okay, people seem to be thinking that it's pretty safe and, you know, seem to have kind of a positive outlook on strangulation and engaging in it like quite a lot. So could we intervene there in any particular way and make any changes to people's views on strangulation? And so what we did was we created our own scale on strangulation kind of perceptions. So positive perceptions, they would rate their agreement to, like, I would enjoy being choked would make me feel excited. And we asked them to rate these questions before and after they received like this very brief piece of education. So that's just some statements about how harmful it can be to be strangled and what the consequences might be. So that could be that you can lose consciousness within 10 seconds and all of these other harmful things. It really was only like 4-5 sentences. And then we measured again, what was their perception of strangulation. So everybody's perceptions of strangulation went down, but women's went down the most. So theirs went down substantially more than men. And again, this is probably because women are more likely to be at the forefront of this risk. It's at the front of their minds. They already know that it's risky and harmful. They're very concerned about experiencing unconsciousness and other harms, and they get more information about, oh, these are all the other things that could happen to you. And so then their positive view of strangulation is even more reduced. So the next study that we did, just very briefly, we wanted to kind of circle back around to this idea and this question of, where are people getting this information from, and how is consent happening? Is consent happening? What's going on there? So this, I think I may have got the numbers around the wrong way here, but anyway, over 4,000 people we had in this study, and we had very much similar results pattern to the previous research. So more than half of people participating in strangulation ever, and about 20-odd%, maybe more, of people saying that they were strangled the last time they had sex. And so here we just ask people, like, where have you ever found out? Where have you ever heard, read, seen any kind of choking or sexual strangulation? And the primary place people are learning this is from pornography. Men more than others, but everybody is getting a healthy dose of strangulation in pornography. And then we also have these other outlets as well. So we have people seeing strangulation in movies, in social media, in magazine articles, and discussing them with their friends. So it's really kind of just this broad spectrum of this. It's really mainstream, and you can see that people who are transgender or gender diverse in that purple bracket really are discussing it a lot with their friends. That's seemingly something that, you know, it's kind of like it's happening, it's in the mainstream, but no one seems to be talking about it openly. So I think that that's really interesting, and something that we probably need to touch upon in the future about how do we educate and intervene here, because we're not telling anybody anything and they're learning from their friends and from porn about how to do this, this actually quite dangerous behavior. And so we have this other question about, okay, this is for people who were choked. When the last time you were choked, like, how did you consent? And so we have a number of people here who is actively kind of saying, I asked them, or they asked me and I said yes, or I said yes, and then I said no during it, like I withdrew my consent. So these people are sort of active in that kind of consent process. We have about 25% of people probably in both of these overall. And then we have this other kind of group here that they didn't consent beforehand at all. So there was no kind of discussion or anything that happened beforehand. They just got choked during sex. And then you have this kind of interesting middle group here, which they're saying that they previously agreed to be strangled. So they're saying, I said yes to being choked, you know, however many times ago, and that's fine. And that is just continuing. It's continuing consent, and I don't need to reapply it. So I think that's pretty interesting and kind of dangerous. And we see a kind of similar pattern play out here for the people who were choking someone. So they're saying, well, when I was choking someone, they really feel probably more so that they asked the person who was choking them said, yes, I want to be choked. And that we asked them, like, it could have been that they grabbed your hand and moved it towards you, or, you know, that they said it out loud, those sorts of things. But really they feeling like, okay, the person who's being choked, they're asking me. And so, but there still is this active consent process. And then a number of people who just are like, I just jump in, I just do it and I don't ask. But then, yeah, still this group of people around about the same amount, so same proportion of people are saying during a previous sexual encounter, they gave their consent to be choked in the future. So I don't need to ask them again. So really, overall, our findings are showing that in Australia, you know, sexual strangulation has become quite a mainstream behaviour that is commonly seen in media of all types, as well as discussed among friends. And it's engaged in by more than half of young adults, including men, women, trans and gender diverse people who have previously had sex. So despite the explicit criminalisation of strangulation, there was little knowledge of either the fact that it is criminalised in some contexts or of the dangers of strangulation. And before any real education intervention, participants reported viewing strangulation during sex as potentially harmful, but also that it could be performed safely. And so, but also kind of that they generally wanted for this to happen. So this really might indicate that criminalisation alone is not a suitable strategy to increase that community awareness of the harms of strangulation. So just putting in a crime and saying all good people will know that it's harmful now. Actually, we're probably really needing these education interventions and strategies to understand and reduce harm, or kind of intervene there, and maybe when they get the information about how harmful it is, then maybe they'll decide that they don't want to participate in any longer. So really we need to develop strong sexual health education around consent and harms, and sort of normative expectations around sexual strangulation in Australia, given that it's become so prevalent. Thank you. And this is a QR code to our website.
Thank you very much, Heather and Leah. Really fascinating research, but also a very impressive research project, like all the different parts that you've put together to really try and understand more about this issue. So thank you very much to both of you for those presentations. Heather and Leah, thanks so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and you know, you've done this incredible work. We'll put a link to Leah and Heather's project on the Helen website with the recording of this. So if you want to follow their project, if you didn't get the QR code from before, you'll be able to go onto the Helen website and get it. So thank you both exceptionally for today's seminar. It was very fascinating and such important work that you're doing. So thanks everyone for joining today. We'll be back for the next Helen seminar on the first Tuesday of March, when we'll have some presenters who are talking about AHPRA's new cosmetic surgery guidelines. So thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the day.